In the heart of Europe, during a time when the world was young, there lived a pope who was as ruthless as he was religious. Pope Sixtus IV, a man of the cloth, had no qualms about spilling blood to satisfy his ambitions. Imagine a world where the most sacred places of worship became battlefields, where the bell that signified the presence of God in the host was also the signal to kill. This is not a tale from a horror movie. It's a snapshot of Europe in the late 15th century, a time when power was won and lost through violence, and the line between church and state was often blurred by the ambitions of men. Picture this: the year is 1478, and the magnificent cathedral of Florence is bustling with worshippers. The air is thick with incense, and the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the stone floor. In the midst of this sacred setting, a conspiracy is about to unfold. Pope Sixtus IV, in league with the powerful Pazzi family, has plotted to eliminate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano. The plan is simple yet horrifying. During the High Mass, when the congregation is most vulnerable, assassins will strike, the signal. The ringing of the bell that marks the elevation of the host, a moment when all eyes are fixed on the altar, and all thoughts are on the divine. Giuliano, the younger and more handsome of the two brothers, falls at the altar, his lifeblood staining the holy ground. But Lorenzo, known as the Magnificent, is not so easily defeated. Drawing his sword, he fights his way to the sacristy, barricading himself inside until help arrives. This event, known as the Pazzi conspiracy, is not just a tale of treachery. It is a window into a world where the pursuit of power often meant the sacrifice of morality. Lorenzo's response to this act of betrayal was swift and brutal. The conspirators were hunted down and punished in a manner that would make even the most hardened hearts flinch. Some were hanged from the balconies of the palace of the Signoria, their bodies left to dangle as a grim reminder of the consequences of crossing the Medici. Others were emasculated, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the Arno River. By the standards of the time, this was not considered excessive. It was a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford, and revenge was a necessary part of survival. But this was not the only act of cruelty in a continent where the rule of law was often overshadowed by the will of the powerful. In 1520, King Christian II of Denmark invaded Sweden, driven by a desire to expand his territory and crush those who opposed him. The Swedish leader, Sten Sture, was killed in battle, and his widow, Dame Christina Gyllenstierna, was forced to surrender. Despite King Christian's promise of a general amnesty, his actions were far from merciful. In a public square in Stockholm, 2 Swedish bishops were beheaded at midnight, and 80 of their parishioners were brutally murdered. The king's cruelty did not stop there. He exhumed Sten Sture's remains, which were by then rotting and infested with maggots, and burned them. In a final act of cruelty, Sten Sture's young son was thrown alive into the flames, and Dame Christina was forced to watch as her family was destroyed before her eyes. She was then sentenced to live out her days as a common prostitute, a fate worse than death in the eyes of many. This era, where such atrocities were not uncommon, was a world vastly different from our own. If a modern European were to travel back in time to the year 1500, they would be struck by the emptiness of the landscape. The continent was covered in vast, dense forests, much like it was when the Romans first encountered it over 1,000 years earlier. These forests were not just a natural barrier. They were a symbol of the wild, untamed nature of the world. Roads were few and far between, and travel was a dangerous and arduous task. The population of Europe was much smaller then, with only about 73 million people living on the continent, a fraction of the population today. Despite the smaller population, the people of the 15th and 16th centuries left a lasting legacy that continues to shape our world. They built some of the most magnificent cities in Europe, each with its own unique character and history. Paris, Naples, and Venice were the largest cities, each with about 150,000 inhabitants. These cities were the centers of trade, culture, and power, and they were protected by formidable walls and towers. The cathedrals that dominated the skylines were not just places of worship. They were symbols of the wealth and influence of the cities they served. The donjon, or central tower, was the heart of the city, where important decisions were made and justice was dispensed. The justice of the time was harsh and unforgiving. Prisons as we know them today did not exist. Instead, criminals were often punished through public executions, mutilation, or banishment. The hangman was a figure of fear and respect, a reminder that the law was not to be taken lightly. The belief that criminals could be reformed or rehabilitated was not a part of the medieval mindset. The focus was on retribution and deterrence, and the methods used were often brutal and public. Life in the cities was not easy. Most people lived in small, crowded houses, and the streets were often dirty and dangerous. Disease was a constant threat, and the life expectancy was much shorter than it is today. But despite the hardships, the cities were vibrant centers of life, where people came together to trade, worship, and socialize. The marketplaces were bustling with activity, and the streets were filled with the sounds of merchants, craftsmen, and entertainers. The world of 1500 was a place of contrasts. On one hand, it was a time of great beauty and creativity, where artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were creating works that would inspire generations to come. On the other hand, it was a time of violence and cruelty, where the pursuit of power often came at a great cost. The people who lived in this world were not so different from us. They had the same desires and fears, the same hopes and dreams. But the world they lived in was shaped by different values and circumstances, and it is through understanding their world that we can gain a deeper appreciation of our own. In many ways, the Europe of the 15th and 16th centuries was a microcosm of the human experience. It was a world where the best and worst of humanity were on display, where great achievements were often accompanied by great atrocities. But it was also a world that laid the foundations for the modern world we live in today. The cities, the institutions, and the ideas that emerged during this time have had a lasting impact on our society, and they remind us that the past is not just a distant memory, it is a part of who we are. As we look back on this tumultuous period, we can see that the world of 1500 was a place of complexity and contradiction. It was a world where the church and the state were often intertwined, where power was wielded with a heavy hand, and where the line between right and wrong was often blurred. But it was also a world where people found ways to thrive and create, to build and to dream. It was a world that, in all its chaos and conflict, was very much alive. And in that, perhaps, lies the greatest lesson of all, that no matter how challenging the world may be, the human spirit endures.